Yeah, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest in our show. Today's guest, Devayani Khare, is someone whose newsletter I've really enjoyed reading. A little bit about our guest before we jump into this conversation. Through her career in communications, she has worked in fields as diverse as fundamental biology, translational research, biodiversity, and conservation, and even as a travel writer. At present, she's an environmental advocacy communicator for an organization called Break Free from Plastic. For the past few years, she has also been running a newsletter called Geosophy that explores geoscience topics. She has always believed that landscapes contain clues to the past and present, and today we delve into her journey. So, Devyani, firstly, thank you so much for making time for this conversation.
Thanks for having me here, Abhishek.
Yeah, and as someone that's read your newsletter for a while, I just wanted to thank you off the top of my head because I feel like reading your newsletter has just brought in this new sense of fascination for, geology and just the structures around our world that we often take for granted. And we normally start this conversation with this question, Devyani. What were you like as a child growing up? What was Devyani like at school? What did she enjoy doing outside school? And, what was your parents' influence on your journey? What did they do professionally? And how did that sort of impact your thinking too?
Okay. Uh, as a child, I guess I was just as wild and curious and lonely. Didn't have too many friends. Uh, I was raised by a single and really strong mother. And at some point, we found ourselves on a school campus that was very far away from the main city. And I frankly think that contributed so much to my development. Uh, Not just was the campus beautiful, just a hillside with a river on one side, which allowed me to just run wild, discover insects and sit on top rocks for hours on end. Also read a lot. Uh, and I think uh, parental influence was just that in allowing me to be and really cultivating a sense of both reading and curiosity. And the school itself was great because it was no exams, no competition, no uniform, very experimental, very hands on. So I really found the time and the space to come out of that little shell. And it seems ironic today that I work in the field of communications after having had such a shy childhood. But I don't think too many people would believe that that's who I was as a kid. So uh, that's pretty much where I was, where I am today.
And from that time, Devyani, what are your earliest memories of learning about geography? Like from those classrooms, do you have any distinct thoughts about that time?
Absolutely. In fact, if there was anything, it was that we had a lot of our learning outside the classroom. And I remember for one of our geography classes, the teacher took us down the hill. We were at the top of that hill. And as we were walking past where the road had cut into the hillside, I remember him pointing out uh, different kinds of weathering. Places where iron had accumulated or copper veins were kind of visible. And in a way, it's strange that I write about a topic that I feel is really best conveyed out in the field. As much as I can, I would love for geography itself to be something that is taught against a backdrop of the very landscapes I speak about. So, in some ways, the writing is a proxy for if I could just bring you out, uh, or maybe have you look at the landscapes around you differently. Uh, that's a memory that stands out, and I always felt that there's got to be a more vivid way to teach some of those concepts, which aren't and shouldn't be restricted to the classroom.
Yeah, and like, through those turbulent teenage years, of high school and university, You mentioned that the school that you went to was a little more open-ended with their assessment criteria, and I'm really interested in that framework because in most schools that we go to here in India, you have this streaming into commerce, science, or arts, and that does restrict your options going ahead. So, did you have a similar structure for your high school time, and how did that lead into your university years from there?
Absolutely. So eventually, our school did um, uh, fit into an ICSE curriculum. So by ninth and 10th, we were giving exams like all the other kids, which really helped us integrate with the overall education system for 11th and 12th when I came to Pune for my junior college. And we had to choose between art, commerce, and science. But because the school had been so conventional and we weren't really fighting for marks, I found it a little difficult to get into science. And somehow the lure of humanities, which were subjects we'd never come across before, psychology, sociology, even languages, I ended up choosing arts. And frankly, it was a really interesting uh, backdrop. Initially, for 11th, 12th, I didn't even elect geography because I knew that the state curriculum was full of boring, where does corn grow? Pinpoint something on the map, and mineral research and human geography. And frankly, those weren't my areas of interest. But sometime during first year, uh, because of the way the electives were offered, I had to drop a subject and there was an overlap, and I eventually ended up choosing geography. So it was an accident of sorts. I was very clear I wanted to do psychology, and suddenly for first year bachelor's geography, the curriculum was geomorphology, which was looking at landscape evolution, looking at really quick processes like volcanoes, earthquakes, flash floods, and slower processes like glaciers, rain, rivers. And it was so appealing. And at the end of that first year, I was supposed to choose my majors. And I finally said, psychology? I'm not sure I would be so thoughtful about other people's problems. What about studying landscapes instead? So I moved my college, moved out of my friend circle, everything. Like, it was a huge transition, and elected geography instead. So I did eventually conform to the art, science, and commerce streams. But interestingly, it was possible to get back to science from arts. And my master's eventually was an integrated course, which had kids from science and arts background. But I ultimately have a master's in arts.
Yeah, like in terms of someone that studies geography, and the reason I also wanted to talk to you, Devyani, I think your career path is so interesting, but it's also your initial educational journey. And I don't think a lot of people are informed about what it's like to make a career in a field that involves geography. And I think you've shown a lot of flexibility in terms of how you've, navigated those professional transitions. But for a student that does want to study geography at the undergraduate and graduate level, because I'm also not very familiar with the terms, so, and some of our listeners may not be. What are some of the subjects you study in that year of specialization in your undergraduate degree and in that graduate program as well?
Um, During the graduation, a lot of focus is on human geography. So no matter, because ultimately your bachelor's is going to be in just geography, with a lot of focus on political geography, human geography, migrations, let's say. We touch a little bit on archaeology, but really not too much, some bit on civilizations, human journeys across the planet. Uh, Whereas for masters, the specialization wasn't just geography. My specialization was geomorphology. So I have a master's in geomorphology, and that gave us a variety of subjects, like you're studying coastal processes, or you're studying river processes, um, glacial processes, though we didn't have too much of a focus on that. We are also situated within a tropical geography, so we studied a few more processes that are based on that. And we had a little bit about sustainable development and natural resource management, as also statistics. So those were kind of the subjects. But overall, there was a lot of scope to look at research and to look at some field components and also a little initial introduction to GIS systems, which at the time was just emerging. It was also possible to specialize in that.
So, like, if you had to define the field of geography, Devayani, for someone that is just interested in it and wants to learn it more, how would you define like geography as a field?
That's a tricky question. Only because I think the scope for geography is expanding so much, and in some ways now, thankfully, more people are looking at geography also as an integrated field. We are talking about economic geography, we're talking about political geography, we're talking about geopolitics as well, and that's a little different from political geography. Uh, Political geography looks at different countries and the territorial divisions, whereas geopolitics looks at the relationships between these different countries in terms of their trade, other policies. I think to define geography, it would just mean it's a snapshot of everything that is connected to landscapes, and how you choose to look at it intrinsically will be through a human lens, but there are deeper time stories. If you look at it from a geological perspective, it would also be possible to explore glacial studies specifically, or sedimentology. So the fields diversify if you have a hardcore background in science, and then if you're looking at it through a humanities lens, you may be able to look at subjects like archaeology or anthropology. And yes, also science can do with paleontology, where you'll be studying fossils. So the scope is really diverse, and I think in India that scope is expanding more and more. Recently, we've also had courses that are offered very specifically on what's known as palynology, where people are studying pollen grains and trying to find ancient records of fossilized pollen grains and what they can tell us about vegetation from old Earth, early Earth.
Yeah, like that's so interesting for someone listening to this for the first time, Devyani, because I'm thinking about a landscape like India. It's so diverse in terms of cultural differences, but reading some of your work, I realized that there's so much richness and diversity in terms of natural landscape as you move from one state to another. And I love the piece where you spoke about these natural heritage sites around India that will be considered for a UNESCO sort. I mean, there was a UN recognition for some of them, and that was such a beautiful piece because when I saw those photos, I'm like, these are such amazing places to visit in my own country, and I've never been very well informed about them. So from the lens of someone living in India, if you could, I'm thinking about the more practical applications of a field like geography. How would if you could give me some examples of how geography would be relevant from a government lens, from an industry lens, and then maybe from an individual lens for a citizen in like a city or in a village in the country. If you have any thoughts about that.
Okay, I'll try to answer that. It's a
Yeah,
very broad question, and
yeah,
sadly for us in India, from a government lens, we've largely looked at what can generate revenue. So a lot of our geo-heritage sites, if any, have been developed, and I haven't really come across an example that we've done really well with. It is about how much revenue we can generate, which is a little ironic because we throw a lot of money at temples and forts, and by right we should. Human history is just as important. But to me, it's always about it being able to tell you stories of 2,000, 3,000 years, whereas geoheritage is telling you stories of 3.5 billion years, sometimes 2.5 billion years. It's talking also about human history through time. We have some prehistoric sites that can be dated to around 30,000 years. So to me, these deep time stories from a government perspective are just as important to preserve. In some ways, they form a living classroom. As much as we have a fascination for museums, we want to gather certain specimens, lock them up, title them, label them, but we're missing that entire story of where that rock came from and how it was formed, and somehow creating museums out of outdoor spaces or of a landscape itself would be that much richer. So I think from a government perspective, I do believe our sites have a lot of value to offer as a geoheritage site. In fact, for those of us who travel abroad, we're seeing that a lot of initiatives, sometimes it's a formation that's not really very spectacular. But abroad, people have done interpretations and they're doing walks and they're like, okay, walk through time and, retrace this history. And here's where you can find dinosaur eggs. We have all of this and more in India. We're just not putting it out there. From an industry perspective, again, the industry in India has been responsible for the damage of a lot of these formations, either inadvertently, which I can't quite believe, or the fact that maybe we've realized its value a little too late and they themselves are not quite aware of it. So we've had the destruction of laterite formations where we'd found prehistoric carvings from around 30,000 years ago that have been destroyed by mining industry. We've had the mining industry similarly in Rajasthan extract iron ore from what are old deposits, and those deposits also have fossil remains of the first ever life forms on Earth. They're known as stromatolites. They date back to something like 2.5 billion years. Ours in Rajasthan are a little more recent, but they were the first creatures on Earth. They're the reason why we have all of this oxygen in the air. They're the reasons why multicellular life even evolved. They were the first ones to photosynthesize and allow our atmosphere to become as oxygen rich. Way more back then, a little lesser now. And all of this is being destroyed by the industry. The lesser said about our coal seams, our iron belts, the better. But yes, I feel the industry could play a role in preserving some sections of it. There are enough and more minerals for the taking. But in some ways, where are we obliterating traces of our history in search of minerals?
And that's such an important point you make, Devayani. And I think what you said about there being enough to utilize for industry and not, crossing a line where we're affecting these natural environments beyond something that's sustainable. I think that's so important for us to understand as a country. And I think in terms of positive examples of regional or state bodies doing things to preserve these sites, maybe from an Indian context or even an international context, like, do you have a story or two where you saw something being done that you think can be a good example for other sections around the world or other places around the world?
I wish I had more examples from India. I know that there are a lot of sites I have to still explore, but the few that I've been to either have not been maintained well enough or the interpretation science lacked a lot. And I think I've been covering a good part of India and I'm still desperately looking for a site that has been well managed. I have seen a fantastic example in the Philippines, a little away from the capital, Manila, around a 2-hour drive. There is this limestone formation called Masungi. It's a georeserve that was developed as a community initiative when the community realized that it's an important watershed and it acts as a sponge for all of Manila's water. And the beauty with limestone formations, we have a lot of such formations in India, is that they form just these absolutely incredible stalactite, stalagmite formations. And the very word masungi, or in Tagalog, masungki, actually means jagged or tooth-like. And that's what the formation looks like. And instead of having walks or trails that go right through the limestone, which can cause a lot of damage, because limestones are very reactive to the elements, to water, to sweat, to the rain. What they've done is they've built these massive metal cable bridges over that landscape. So you can still take it in. All of the revenue goes to the community that in turn preserves this site. And what they're able to do with the help of local guides is point out certain rare fauna, certain rare species. There's a really, really tiny micro snail, in fact, in that habitat that they're also able to point out, along with a lot of other biodiversity. And because the community explores that landscape regularly, they're also able to maintain checklists, add to the overall knowledge. And I would really love to see something like that in India. Better still, if I could be a part of it. I think there's so many stories waiting to be told in India. We just need to look at it from a slightly different lens.
And is there like a government body or a professional organization that coordinates and regulates efforts in this regard?
I think
At
for archaeology, there is the Archaeological Survey of India. I think it has done good work, but there has been a lot of criticism for their work as well. There is the Geological Survey of India, though they are more focused on research rather than creating experiences from these sites. So yes, they do have a classification of geoheritage sites across the country. There are certain bodies like the Society of Earth Scientists. It's an independent little unit of researchers from across the country that are pushing to have UNESCO classify some of our geoheritage as global geoparks. That's one of the criteria that could be really interesting. It would be comparable to a UNESCO World Heritage Site, except with geography or geoheritage as the component. Beyond that, no, I don't think there are too many bodies that focus on it. Again, a lot of research is being done. INTAC is another body that has been compiling resources and coming up with reports on geoheritage, and independent researchers also from across the country.
And like just to move into a little bit of a tangent, Devayani, coming back to your professional career post university, I was just going through your professional experiences. There are such a diverse set of organizations you worked for, like Kids for Tigers in Pune, or the Water Resources and Management Institute in Pune, and there was the Western Ghats Biodiversity Portal in Pondicherry. You also had some time working in a school, and then there was some time working in a travel company. I find this so interesting, because you often look at careers in like a very linear sort of way. So what I wanted to ask you was, how did the skills you learned in your undergraduate and graduate program help you do each of these jobs? So if you could chronologically tell me what you sort of learned from each of these jobs, and what you were doing in those contexts, that would be really interesting for someone that is looking for a career in this field and wants to know more about it.
Abhishek, I may have to burst your bubble here a
Yeah.
little bit, because that's where academic learning differs from on-the-job learning, and the ability to adapt that you need once you step into a career. So to be completely honest, after my degree in geography, I found it very difficult to find jobs in India. People were telling me, but maybe you could try marketing, or you can try like a bunch of subjects that weren't really integral to my interests. Along with my master's, I'd also done a diploma in natural resource management and nature conservation. And I feel the first job that I got, which was the Pondicherry Research Institute, where I worked on a Western Ghats biodiversity portal, was because of that qualification. Less, and over time, people just forgot what I'd done my master's in. So I think in some ways, because the subject was interdisciplinary, or because I had come from this background which allowed me to learn based on my interest rather than just follow like a single academic path, I think that held me in better stead through my career, because a lot of these opportunities came up which I think a lot of times you would feel, well, I don't know if I'm quite qualified for that. And a lot of times it was driven by, but this would be really fascinating to do, right? So when I moved to Pondicherry, for instance, I knew nobody there. This job came up out of the blue. It was supposed to be based in Bangalore. And suddenly they said, hey, no, it's a Pondicherry based thing. And I said, sure, why not? I've never been there. And biodiversity or wildlife conservation research picked up in those fields more. So right now, you also mentioned that I worked in fundamental biology and translational research. This was at a biological sciences institute. Me, without even a graduation in sciences. So in some ways, the main focus throughout all of these different careers, as different as they seem, was really communication. And that was something that I have no qualification for, but it was something that I was able to pick up in all these different jobs. And in some ways, build a toolkit for myself of how you apply communications to all these different fields, and how is it that you'd use similar set of tools to perhaps talk about wildlife, talk about conservation, talk about fundamental biology. And perhaps it helped me, coming from a non-pure science field myself, to be that perfect person in the middle, right? I was the bridge between an audience that doesn't know and a very technical audience, to try and distill some of the science that may have come across in very technical terms, jargon heavy, and how do I really translate that for audiences? Not dumb it down, translate it. Find those connections, find those analogies, connect it with pop culture. That was also really fascinating to do. And there were enough and more such examples where I was able to connect certain stories that may have sounded very starchy, just the science of it. But then to be able to connect it to something that people know, that I think was greater learning and a strength. And that is something I continue to build on today. So the geoscience writing came only much, much later, when I felt people have an appetite for this. And it's taken me all these years to kind of get back to my field and my area of interest. But yes, it's been an interesting journey.
And I think that piece you mentioned about being that bridge between the work being done on the field and people that want to know more about it, I think it's a very underrated role in an organization, especially with regards to some of the organizations you were involved with, right? And I think there's a lot of, and it's so interesting that you had this background in the arts, but today a lot of the writing and work you are doing is connected to to science and a more fundamental sort of way. But I feel like there are certain ways of thinking in both fields that intermingle or find this overlap, and I feel like doing that really well needs a good grounding in both disciplines, whether it's the science or the arts. So for like, in terms of, because you've also worked as a freelance communication consultant, Devayani, what does that job look like on a day-to-day basis? When you work for an organization, what does a communications consultant do? Like, is it primarily handling the internal communications, or is it also involve external communications with regards to media that is sent out? And I think media is such a complex term today, right? You have companies with their websites that become their primary source, but then you also have internal reports, annual reports, and then newsletters and social media becoming its whole gamut. So, I mean, there are so many layers to communication. So, if you could break down what communication is for someone interested.
In some ways, communication is all of this, and that is the challenge really in identifying which are the optimal channels, right? Because right now, a lot of these social media tools, having a website, all of these don't cost too much. But is it effective to put up your message just about everywhere? If you are going to put it up everywhere, does it need to be tweaked a little, or will the same broadcast work? How are you marketing or promoting it differently? So as a freelancer, one of the biggest challenges really was that there was a lot of time spent on the groundwork, on the pitching, on the proposing, on the articulating of, okay, if this is what you want to do, objectives first, this is a plan that you can put in. A lot of times with clients, they had an idea and they felt, oh, but we need to do social media, but maybe social media wasn't the optimal channel for them. And it was about pushing back and saying, no, but if you're focusing on, let's say, investors getting funding, you need to look at different platforms. platforms. You need to have, let's say, an asset where people can come back and see what you're all about. One of my learnings has also been that social media is massively overrated as a communication tool or as a communication first approach. It's easy, it's visible, but ultimately social media needs to be like a come hither. It's your little glass window which tells people to come inside and see what more. And that see what more can then lead traffic back to your website or other assets. So a lot of the freelancing work was about showing customers this entire journey, all of the components that weave together to create a brand of sorts. At an organization, interestingly, it's a little different because the brand is present. All of your assets are in place. It now really is about seeing that once you have something emerging from the organization, from a space, a report, let's say, or a particular fact sheet, it's about seeing how you can optimize it for different platforms. It's about seeing how perhaps you can repurpose it, because that report took a lot of time and energy and money. But is it ideal to just put out as is with a link? Or can you distill it into different components? Can you have, let's say, a social media campaign for it, which will be little bite-sized pieces of that and then lead back to the main? Could it be a video, for instance? So I think repurposing and getting as much mileage as you can from the collateral that's been developed is a key strategy for organizations. Whereas with a freelancing journey, it's really about articulating a long-term communication plan. And also, both sides to this, what's very important is as many people as you bring into this journey, into this creative mix, those many more ideas you're going to have to play around with. Because understanding what you're trying to achieve is more important than identifying just the channels. And more often than not, people tend to do channel first, platform first, and then they say, oh, but this is what we're trying to achieve. So it's been an interesting learning at both aspects, but freelancing is a hard sell.
And I think that's quite interesting for someone interested in that sort of space, of communications in that world as well. And I like what you said about the difference between social media, being the primary source and it just being a window, because you can have a lot of followers, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're engaging with them in the way that your organization wants to engage with them. So, yeah, and in terms of your newsletter, Devayani, I know you went back to it 2020, am I right? 2019 is when you started it. So, like, I'm curious about the story behind that. You're in this professional job, you're working. What made you want to go back to writing about, geoscience topics? And, tell me more about the name Geosophy and what's the story behind that as well.
Great. First off, I think, as I said, I'd spent years communicating about science, about wildlife, conservation. And at some point, I put up a little Twitter thread on an interesting geological formation that you can see just about everywhere in the country, but around Bangalore specifically. And it went viral. Now, by viral, I mean 500 likes, which frankly for content on geoscience is viral enough. And my interest was piqued. I said, people are interested in this kind of content. That's strange. So I put out a little poll to say, hey, would people be interested in this kind of content on a more regular, slightly long form basis? And the response was overwhelming. So at that point, my Twitter handle was geo_sophist. And when I come up with it, the word sophist to me means somebody who goes out in search of knowledge. The entire quest of Sophia, that word, it's present in all of your philosophies and your. So that Sophie is the same knowledge gathering. So Geosophy for me was just a way to say I'm somebody who's in quest all the time of knowledge about the earth. So yes, at that point, I'd started doing short form blogs of research, current research for an American Geophysical Union's blog. All they wanted was to look at certain papers, condense it, and lead people back to it. And that was a very interesting format. I'd been in science communication for so long, but I'd never really taken a stab at doing it for the fields that I was most passionate about. So it was a good challenge. And from that, there came the sense that, hey, this kind of content is getting good attention. So I set up a little MailChimp newsletter, and I had 70 people subscribe for the first newsletter, which again, it's a tiny, tiny audience, but these were all people who'd been following me on Twitter, who kind of knew, who would tag me on certain landscapes and say, hey, what is this? So I'd already started building a little bit of a brand there. People knew that this is what I was doing. But in a way, the newsletter was also a learning journey. What I wanted it to be, first off, is to connect with my field again, to catch up on some of the advances in it, and to keep myself updated about what's happening, what's new, what's exciting, and hopefully to be able to convey some of my enthusiasm, make it contagious for other audiences. So frankly, with each newsletter, it's a research journey for me to begin with. I dig deeper. I look at different resources. I've been wrong on an occasion, and someone pointed that out to me, and I was very happy. And they provided research links, and I was like, "Oh, this is really great," because it built on my understanding, and that is, again, as I mentioned, I wanted to be that bridge between a topic and a concept I found fascinating, and to be able to convey that to broader audiences. So yes, the newsletter celebrated 4 years this June. It was supposed to be a monthly initiative, but it's been difficult to make time for it. And at some point, with all content creation, you need to make peace with the fact that you're putting something out there that is a labor of love. And you'd rather put out good stuff, interesting stuff, than churn it out on a regular basis. So I made my peace with that. And now I hope that the newsletters continue to bring that little value. And I do hear back from people every now and then. Makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, and I think for me as a reader, I think one of the joys of a platform like Substack in particular is the ability to explore the archives, and I know in a lot of social media platforms it's about what comes up most recently. But I think when I was able to look through the Geosophy archives, I mean, I feel like each piece that you must have written must have taken a whole month of work. But as a reader, I got to experience it, in like a couple of days. Though I just find that really interesting, and the reason I'm saying that is because I'm curious about your process as a writer, Devayani. I know there's a visual element to your writing where you have photos of these sites that you talk about, and I know you're an advocate of being on these sites, and you feel like writing builds on that. So if you could tell me about one or two pieces that you wrote on the newsletter and your research process to bring that piece to life, and I've made some notes about, I love the UNESCO, the series where you featured all those sites, and I mean it's one of my goals to visit each one of them, hopefully sometime soon. So yeah, if you could just tell me the story behind one or two pieces, your research process and how it came to life.
I think it's a well-known truth that as a content creator, you need to be plugged into a lot of different kinds of content. And frankly, that's where all journeys begin. I'm actively reading different books, listening to different things, because I need something that's going to spark my interest if I want to spark that interest in somebody else. So a lot of the ideas for the newsletter have come from something I was reading at the time. It could have been a book, it could have been an article, it could have been a research paper that I felt, hey, this is fascinating, but there's a way to perhaps tease this apart that will make it more fascinating. And some, I would like it to be more, but some of my articles have also been based on my personal travels. And that's where some of the lessons have come from, like the Masungi example I gave you earlier was based on my travel there, and I've written an entire newsletter on that because I loved the fact that it was so community driven. So I guess just to run through the particular piece that you're talking about, in fact, it was a little bit of a fun exercise. To be completely honest, I haven't been to all of those sites myself, but they're on my list. And in some ways, they're not up for serious consideration. I don't have any power, strings to pull. It was just a wish list of sorts to say, if we could identify India's first geopark, what would it be? And to be very honest, I'm sure people chose sites that they have read, perhaps just visited more, though all the sites demand equal weightage, I feel. I'd be very torn to poll on that myself. So just as background for those who aren't familiar, Abhishek's referring to a post where I'd created this little poll of India's top geosites. Trying to balance out states, I haven't done a fair job at representing all of the geoheritage that is there. And then I'd put up little blurbs on each of the pieces. So they feature destinations like Sundarbans for the mangroves. There are marble ghats in central India near Beda Ghat. There's the Lonar crater, which was a meteoric impact in Maharashtra. There's Zog Falls in Karnataka and Gandikotta in Andhra Pradesh. Which I highly recommend. It's one of those landscapes I truly feel that if someone is blindfolded and put at the edge of that formation, that's it. That's your key into everything. You open the blindfold and the person is going to be so wowed by it. And that is the starting point for all communication, where they ask the question, what happened here? How was this formation created? And that, I think, is the perfect segue, because at a place like that, I don't need to do the groundwork. That site itself is this wow site that should spark off the curiosity and questions, and those are the kind of stories I would like to tell more of from across the country. So yes, my journey is mostly about looking at an idea or a concept that sparks an interest. Could be a destination, could be a concept itself, or could be a lesson that I've learned from seeing or traveling somewhere. And after that, what I try to do is try to see what else has been written about that place before, because I don't want to be writing it in the same way or treating it in the same style. So I dig up a little and try to see, okay, what have people written about this? And then I try to go back to what it is that caught my attention about this place. How am I going to convey it to somebody else? So sometimes it takes me around 10 to 12 or 20 hours of research I've clocked on certain newsletters where I might need to pass through a lot of research papers and try to understand the formation for myself. The beauty or the challenge, however you choose to look at it, is that with geography and deep time stories, there aren't always definite answers. I can give you theories, I can give you hypotheses to say it may have happened like this or it may have happened like that. And in some ways, research is also just as conflicted about how certain formations were formed. To me, it's interesting to showcase all the different theories, but then again, I also want that it isn't overwhelming for an audience. So I try to pare down things, or I say, okay, I'm not going to talk much about that and focus on a few things that I feel are enough to give someone a sense of wonder for that landscape. I also love weaving in popular culture references or religious or mythical references, because I think that is a context we already have at the back of our heads. If I start telling you a story, perhaps differently from the way your grandmother told it, but if I start telling you a story from Ramayana or Mahabharata, these are characters a lot of us are familiar with and we'll pick up on, and then to be able to say, okay, in these epics, this is how the formation has been explained, but wait a minute, the geology is actually more fascinating, and this is the story. So I try to find those hooks and build on that. And eventually, yes, it is about having some visual elements. At some point, I thought I'd be okay to sketch out certain things. I've done that with certain formations. I've actually drawn out textbook-like diagrams of different glacial formations, for instance, or but it takes a lot of work, and can't always find photos as exciting as the place actually is, but the visual aspect is very important, and that's pretty much the recipe of most blogs.
And then even the places that you mentioned, Devyani, like the Lonar crater in Maharashtra, the fact that something from outside this planet may have landed on our planet, and there's a site where it's been preserved. And I think in one of your pieces you mentioned that the flora and the fauna in that particular lake is very different compared to other areas, in that particular region. And even with the Gandikotta Fort, I remember a picture you had shared where there were two people standing on top of the fort looking out. And for some reason, that picture caught my attention over just the visual. So, like, do you have some historical stories about what happened around that formation in terms of the dynasties that used it as a fort, Viviani?
Absolutely. But at this point, I may need to refer you to the article itself, because what I did with Gandikotta specifically is I was keen on the geological history, but I knew that its story would be incomplete without talking about the dynasties that built the fort. In fact, there's a granary nearby, there's an old temple, and there's also a Jama Masjid. And the fort itself is precariously perched on the edge of the canyon formation. So for that particular story, what I did is I collaborated with Chinmay Kulkarni, who writes a blog called Itineraries of I Elephant Headed. And he was able to tackle the historical aspects of it, and I was able to look at the geology of it. So there are fascinating characters from not too long ago who assumed that stage and fought their battles from there and built not just the Jama Masjid, but used those granaries. And he's very beautifully painted that. So I think that particular blog was interesting because it allowed us to marry the history and the geology. So maybe going back to that or adding that to the show notes might do it more justice than what I can describe right now.
Sorry. So what I will do, Devyani, is all the articles that we have spoken about and the newsletter, I will have show notes linking to them. And I feel like that's a better way to engage with those pieces in detail because there are lots of references and links that you may have to follow up on. And I highly recommend, that particular article that you wrote with Chinmay. So, and I know another thing on your newsletter, you have this link to a shelf on Goodreads about the books that you love related to this field. And I used to be a classroom teacher again. And one of the things I used to ask my kids to do is to come and talk about your book and tell us a couple of lines about why someone else should read it. And when I looked at that list, I found the topic so interesting, but I wanted to ask you, like, if you had to give me a couple of recommendations from that list, and maybe tell me what about these books will really stay with me as a reader. I'd really love to know that from your perspective.
Great. I think as somebody based in India, I would highly, highly recommend Pranay Lal's Indica. In some ways, it was the first book that we're seeing which paints this deep time story of India. Speaking of some of its oldest rocks, it starts in fact right here on the outskirts of Bangalore at Nandi Hills, and it traces the entire planetary history of the landscape that we see today. It's a beautiful journey. It's written really nicely, excitingly in fact, and it also weaves in elements of evolution, biodiversity, and a little bit about human history as well. So especially in terms of some of the craters, it does speak about the Dhala crater as well, along with a lot of other semi-familiar and some unusual sites across India. So that is a book that I would highly recommend. For broader reading on geography, there's an author called John McPhee. And just as a compendium, a lot of his books have been written beautifully. He has books that are talking about Krakatoa. He has a book talking about California. as a jigsaw puzzle of land masses that kind of got stitched together. So his writing style is very interesting, and it offers a broader range of topics that people may want to dive into. So I recommend the author. Once you see his list of books, for instance, you can pick up something that resonates more with you. Apart from that, there are books on everything from, let's say, fossils to even birds. It sadly is a limitation of Substack. I seem to be unable to do justice to a proper bookshelf on Substack. I wish there was a kind of integration which allowed me to do that better. For now, it seems a little clunky to just put books there, but at some point, my newsletters, when I was running them off MailChimp, had regular reading features. And in all honesty, a lot of those books are on my to-read lists as well. So sometimes I've had recommendations from friends. I've reached out to other people when the topic was something that I haven't read up much about as well. So it's a lovely Frankenstein list of sorts pieced together from recommendations.
And I will be linking that in the show notes as well for someone that's curious about the topic and interested in those areas. And Devayani, I as a teacher, that's something I wanted to ask you. In an ideal world, where we had the resources, within a school setup, how would you organize or plan teaching sessions related to geography that would keep children engaged and really open up the field to them, from a more curious lens rather than just an academic lens? Yeah.
That's a lovely question. Thanks, Abhishek. I think there's a million different ways to do this. Sometimes the resources can be something as simple. My school had a little weather station set up on top of a little hillock, and week on week, a pair of kids, I think, were responsible for going up there, taking the readings, and writing them on a whiteboard. The fascination that kids have for just writing on both a blackboard or a whiteboard is understated. So we took great joy in going up to that hillock before breakfast when it was our turn, and come back down and put in the weather on that whiteboard, right? Way more fun than looking at a weather app, even if you may want to account for some human errors in the actual readings. I think that's not as important. Apart from that, I think a good starting point for schools would really be to stock up libraries with materials that allow kids to go out there and explore what's around them. Even basic introductions to what are the kind of rocks. How do you tell apart the three rocks? I think we all learnt in school that there's igneous and sedimentary and metamorphic. But what does it look like in the field? And that somehow could be such a simple starting point. So I think a field expedition that either showcases how these rocks differ, and I think moreover having field excursions to nearby locations. You don't all need to go to some place fancy. Awakens the thought that there is something fascinating, maybe right in our backyard, close enough to access. So last year I had the opportunity to go to Mangalore, and when the teacher called me up and they said, we're thinking of having this kind of a trail for students in Mangalore. Maybe we could look at laterite formations. And I was like, no. There's a far more fascinating formation. I know it's a little far away from Mangalore, but there is an 88 million year formation on an island, very accessible from Mangalore. And what we were able to do is take the school kids to this island, which was a fascinating trip in and of itself, because you took a ferry from Udupi. It's loud music, you go there, and what you see is evidence of when India and Madagascar unzipped from each other. The two continents tore apart, and a proxy of this formation can be found in Madagascar. And I remember joking to the kids saying, your ancestors, had they hitched a ride on Madagascar, you would have been lemurs by now, right? So it's about creating that sense of wonder. And this was a formation that they had heard about, or some of them had visited with their parents, and there aren't enough signs there to give you this sense of 88 million year history. and look at where Madagascar is today. To think that India and Madagascar were together and drifted apart, and today they are where they are. I think there's enough and more available. So if schools prioritized this, I think learning can be fun. And then bringing kids back. So once you've sparked off their enthusiasm like that, to have resources in the library for them to follow up on, or little rock kits or mineral libraries are also available, where they can take a little magnifying glass and look at different rock specimens and hopefully bring in their own specimens to examine as well. That would be a great start.
Yeah, and that was one of the pieces I really enjoyed, and I sent you a message about it because I got to visit that island, and actually reading your piece helped me understand the importance of what I saw there. I actually remember touching the texture of those rocks and just thinking that I've never seen anything like this in my entire life. And then when I realized and I read your piece about the fact that it was connected to Madagascar, I'm like, wow, that's really special, in that sense. The last question I wanted to ask you, Devayani, just to respect time, and I know you're someone that loves traveling a lot. So what kind of traveler are you, and what are some places you have really enjoyed visiting? And as someone that is curious about the geography of these places, if you can tell us some stories about things you've observed from your travels in India and around the world.
I think I'm a traveler of too many interests, and that gets to be a bit of a conflict when choosing a destination because each of them need dedicated time. I love wildlife. So when I go out looking for wildlife, you go all out, guns blazing, camera, binoculars, and at the time you may or may not be able to take in landscapes. If you go in quest of, let's say, a geoheritage site, it's a very different kind of a lens. I love culture as well, traveled a lot, done the usual temples, things like that. So for me, it's always conflicting to choose a destination and then say, okay, I need to drop everything else and really just focus on this as is. As much as I love landscapes and geoheritage, frankly, my go-to destinations have always been wildlife. And I feel they tell very interesting stories also about the landscape. In some ways, one of the lesser asked questions in biodiversity is, why is this creature found here? Where else is it found? And what are some of the stories we can tell about landscapes from that time? I'll give you an example. Last December, I traveled to Kaziranga, and in Kaziranga, we saw what was known as the Malayan squirrel. It's a giant, beautiful, dark brownish creature. And the thought that the name says Malayan squirrel meant I dug up and I tried to see where else it's found. And incredibly, it's found all the way across the Malay Peninsula, which means in Assam, we're seeing its westernmost distribution. And the thought that a squirrel species can exist between here and Malaysia tells you so much about the connection of what was a forest at some point, because these creatures need continuous canopy. And to think that there was a huge swathe of forest that stretched all the way from Assam to Malaysia at some point, and now it's gotten fragmented, so you see these species a little bit more scattered. Another very interesting landscape for me was Kenya. I was there a couple of years ago, and I've also written about it because in some ways, Kenya and that entire Rift Valley stretch is where we found the oldest remains of human remains, human fossils, right from Neanderthals to older creatures to present day Homo erectus. And in some ways, that is, let's say, the cradle of civilization, as we call it. And then from there, our species migrated across the world. So very often biodiversity is tied to landscapes. And I'm most curious about those formations. I travel a lot for birds as well. Yes. As for landscapes, again, as I said, there's enough. Anywhere you go, it's really about looking out for some of the landscapes to see what it is that they indicate. A lot of people who travel to Ladakh, for instance, go there, of course, for the sheer beauty. They go there for the lakes. There's a bit of culture. There are monasteries there. But I don't think anybody traveling to Ladakh hasn't asked questions about the landscape itself. It is so vivid. It's in your face. You see mountains which are half purple, half green. You cannot fail to ask, whoa, what happened here? You see these massive formations in the middle of nowhere along rivers' edges. And if you dug a little deeper, they're around 58 million years old, 53 million years old, which actually indicate when the India plate crashed into the Asia plate. So different stories, different destinations. I'm always torn.
Yeah, and I think on that note, we do come to an end of this episode of Learning Stories. I will be linking Devyani's wonderful newsletter in the show notes. And if you're interested in some of the stories, she shared here, which I want to tell you are just a tiny part of the stories she's shared on her newsletter. I highly recommend, following this conversation up with that newsletter. But Devyani, for anyone interested in your work, what are some ways they can read your work on the internet or reach out to you?
Self-plugging, but frankly, the newsletter is that one-stop shop. All of the articles I've written on geoscience reside there. As Abhishek mentioned, there's an archives that dates back to 4 years that could be interesting. And hopefully these, because they're deep time stories, they're evergreen, so you can pick them up at any point. And hopefully add to that story, continue. I hope it sparks that interest for you to travel to these locations as are accessible to you, and bring more to light. All of my material exists there, and there is a direct link to reach me. Most of my newsletters you can either respond to, you can subscribe. I have a Geosophy newsletter at Gmail address that I'm accessible on, where a lot of people reach out to me to offer either feedback or kudos for the newsletter, even a correction on that one occasion, as I mentioned. So I'm always open to new ideas and feedback, as also any shared stories of where you've been and what sparked that interest, and if there's anything of value there, because that's how I'm going to learn too, and hopefully be able to share that.
Thank you, Devyani. And that's one of the reasons I started this podcast. I really wanted to, in a small way, create a kinder and more empathetic version of the internet where we hold space for each other and where we slowly start to appreciate the years of effort, love, learning, and sacrifice that goes into building a career in any field. And you can see Devyani's passion come through in her love for the world of geography, not only in terms of her basic training, but also in terms of how passionate she is about getting that message out to the world. So stay tuned for more such stories on this podcast. And until next time, keep learning. Thank you.